In the first half of this semester, the lecture series were centered around skeletal muscle physiology, and we discussed, particularly in the bioenergetic series, that muscle function like contractions depend on other organ systems as well. For example, to contract a muscle, one other organ system that is required is the nervous system, since all the processes to contract the muscle requires a voluntary neural stimulus. In the bioenergetics lecture, I talked about the processes by which the energy is provided for muscle contractions. I emphasized that the prioritized and predominant energy system in the body, including muscle, is the aerobic system. And you should be familiar with the fact by now that the aerobic system requires oxygen to oxidize fuel molecules and to use the energy from the fuel to form ATP, which is the energy currency for the entire body. Another fact that I emphasize is that oxygen delivery and availability to cells like muscle cells is critical for aerobic ATP production. And when the oxygen demand goes up, but the oxygen delivery and availability is insufficient, the cell would be in a hypoxic stress situation. And specifically in muscle cells, this would cause acute muscular fatigue as a stress relief response. So how does the oxygen get to the cells? More specifically, how does oxygen get to muscle cells? And how does oxygen delivery increase when muscles have an increased demand like during exercise? Most of us would answer the cardiorespiratory and cardiovascular system, and that is correct. Aerobic ATP production, which again is the muscle's primary energy system, is fully dependent on the cardiovascular system's ability to deliver oxygen at the rate the muscle cells need it. So without proper functioning of the cardiovascular system, muscle contractions and therefore exercise can be limiting, since again, when the oxygen availability does not meet oxygen demand, there is fatigue. So in this lecture series, we will talk about how the cardiovascular system responds to a situation when the muscles have an increased rate of oxygen demand. This is collectively described as the acute cardiovascular response to exercise. I will first discuss the cardio part of cardiovascular by discussing how the heart responds to a greater oxygen demand in muscle during exercise. In other words, to keep it simple, how does the heart pump out more blood? Then I will talk about the vascular part of cardiovascular. How do blood vessels deliver more blood to the muscles that require more oxygen? We're talking about muscle blood flow, in other words. Now, before delving into the cardiovascular response to exercise, we need to be sure that there is a good understanding of basic cardiovascular physiology. How do the heart and blood vessels work, in other words? So to establish the fundamentals, here we have the individual components of the cardiovascular system and a brief descriptor next to each term to help you visualize the general function of these components. First, we have the component that represents the cardio in cardiovascular, and that is the heart. We all generally understand that the heart acts as a pump, and to act like a pump, it needs to contract. And in order to contract, it needs specialized contractile tissue called muscle. So the heart is primarily made up of muscle tissue. And what is that type of muscle called? It's not skeletal muscle like your biceps and triceps. It's cardiac muscle. This is also referred to as the myocardium, and it's made up of myocardial cells, cardiac muscle cells. So the heart is a pump to create pressure gradients so that fluid can flow from the heart to other parts of the body. More on that later. So what is this fluid I am referring to? I am referring to a type of liquidized tissue called blood, which are made up of various cells, but mainly red blood cells. Now, blood is described here as a vehicle, and that represents the fundamental function of blood. Like a vehicle, it allows for the transport of things that needs to get from one area of the body to another. So what type of things are transported in blood? In other words, what type of things circulate in the body? Well, I alluded to one earlier, oxygen. Oxygen is essential for the survival of cells because it is required for cellular bioenergetics, particularly through the aerobic system. So oxygen circulates throughout the body in the vehicle called blood. So what else? We have products of metabolisms like carbon dioxide and water, which we discussed in the prior lecture series. What else is transported in blood? Communication molecules like hormones. Hormones are secreted by a particular gland and it circulates in blood so that it can exert its effects on different cells in the body. For example, in our prior lecture series, I talked a little bit about insulin. Insulin can be secreted by the pancreas and circulate in the blood towards other cells like muscle cells, for example, and stimulate glucose uptake in muscle cells. What else is transported in blood? What do cells, in addition to oxygen, need to acquire energy to produce ATP? fuel molecules like glucose, fatty acids, creatine, and amino acids. They all need to get from one place, say like the liver or from your intestinal tract, to say your muscle, your brain, your bones, etc. They travel in the vehicle blood. All right, so blood is the vehicle. Now, through what passageways can this vehicle travel through? What roads can it take? Blood, along with all the things in it, like described earlier, travel through blood vessels, and this describes the vascular part of cardiovascular. First, we have arterial blood vessels, or arteries simply. This is described here as high pressure distribution, meaning these are the blood vessels that distribute blood and all the things in it from the heart to the rest of the body. Now, of course, we will discuss this further later, but arteries are high pressure because they have the ability, just like the heart, to contract and relax. In vascular physiology, we call this vasoconstriction and vasodilation, respectively. This means, just like the heart, arteries have muscle tissue, but this type of muscle is smooth muscle. And the reason why the arteries have smooth muscle to produce vasoconstriction and vasodilation is to produce pressure gradients so that blood can flow and be effectively distributed to the rest of the body. As I said, we will discuss this further later in much more detail. But we should generally understand that fluids flow from high to low pressure. So wherever the arteries are constricted, there is high pressure, and where it's dilated, there is low pressure. So the blood will flow from where it's constricted to where it's dilated. Now keep in mind, although arterial blood is mostly oxygenated, there is an artery in the body that does not carry oxygenated blood. We will discuss that in the next slide. Okay, so blood travels away from the heart towards the various tissues in the body. The arteries branch off into smaller arteries called arterioles, which then integrate with very small vessels or microvessels. These microvessels are called capillaries, and they surround all the tissues in the body. In the capillaries, exchanges between cells and the blood occur. It's like a bus, which is the blood, dropping off passengers and picking up new passengers from the bus stop. For instance, in the capillaries, the blood drops off oxygen to the cells and picks up CO2 from the cells. In the capillaries, fuel molecules like glucose is dropped off to the cells, and the blood picks up, say, lactate from the cells. So this is why we call capillaries exchange vessels, or more specifically, exchange microvessels. So as blood flows from the heart, through the arteries, through the capillaries, it comes out the other end of the capillary network into veins. Veins are the counterpart to arteries and are described as low pressure return. So first, the word return simply refers to the return of blood to the heart, and this is mostly deoxygenated blood, except again for one type of vein. But either way, veins return blood to the heart, and this is called venous return. Next, we see that veins are described as low pressure. One of the key reasons why they are low pressure is because of the lack of smooth muscle, which is unlike the arteries, meaning they do not have an intrinsic ability to constrict and relax, intrinsic meaning by itself. So to create pressure gradients for blood flow back to the heart, the veins rely on external pumping mechanisms to create constriction and dilation. We will of course discuss this in much more detail later. The low pressure aspect of veins also explains why when you puncture a vein, it's not that big of a deal. You won't have blood squirting out violently because again, there is low pressure. If you puncture an artery, this is a big deal. Blood violently will squirt out of an artery if punctured because again, arteries are high pressured because of smooth muscle causing vasoconstriction in various areas of the arterial vessels. Okay, so that is the general breakdown of the cardiovascular components, and I am assuming this is not anything new to you all since this is a refresher from your basic human physiology course. So with all that said, if we were to describe the overall function of the cardiovascular system, it would be to unify the body as a whole, providing a route of transportation and communication, transporting things like oxygen, and communication between organs and cells through things like hormones. In the context of exercise, we know the major role of the cardiovascular system in response to the stress of exercise is to meet the rising oxygen demand of active skeletal muscle. But before we get into that, let's go over some more basic cardiovascular physiology. Now, one piece of information that is expected for all of you to simply know by heart is the route of circulation throughout the cardiovascular system. This should be in your knowledge bank, so to check your understanding, let's quickly refresh the circulation of blood through the cardiovascular system. First, we have the heart, which again is the pump of the cardiovascular system. And this is again the ultimate regulator of blood flow. We should all know the four compartments of the heart. On the right, we have the right atrium and the right ventricle. On the left, we have the left atrium and the left ventricle. Now in a textbook, the right and left compartments will be flipped because it displays the heart from a first-person view. So in a textbook, the right atrium and ventricle will be on your left. But this illustration here is just an abstract visual just to provide a simple depiction of blood circulation through the cardiovascular system. So here we have the right side of the heart and then the left side of the heart here. Okay, so here we have blood vessels and the pulmonary system. The lungs. From the right ventricle to the lungs, we have the pulmonary artery. And leaving the lungs, back to the heart, into the left atrium, we have the pulmonary vein. So remember, arteries carry blood away from the heart, while veins carry blood towards the heart. And these are the particular incidences where there is deoxygenated blood in the artery and oxygenated blood in a vein. More on this in a moment. Now we have more vessels here. We have systemic arteries. So arteries supplying blood to the rest of the body, leaving the left ventricle. And as we mentioned in the previous slide, the arteries will funnel into capillary microvessels surrounding tissue, like muscle as shown here. And then we have venous return through the veins into the right atrium. So let's go ahead and follow blood throughout the system. Now, when we see blood represented by the color blue, what does that usually tell us? Blue usually describes blood that is deoxygenated. Now, it is rarely fully deoxygenated. Deoxygenated blood can range from 60 to 80% oxygenated during rest and down to about 25% oxygenated during maximum exercise. We will discuss this more later, but for now, just know that we have deoxygenated blood starting in the right atrium. Now, the heartbeat, as you know, is 2 thumps consecutively. The first sound occurs during the pumping or contraction of the atrium. Now, both atriums are going to contract simultaneously, as you see here. But let's just focus on the right atrium. The atrial contraction will push the deoxygenated blood into the right ventricle. Then you have the second sound of the heartbeat. This is when the ventricles contract. So as the right ventricle contracts, the deoxygenated blood flows through the pulmonary artery. And this is the only incidence when deoxygenated blood travels through an artery. It is through the pulmonary artery. And as you can see, as the deoxygenated blood passes through the pulmonary artery and through the capillary network surrounding the alveoli in the pulmonary system, exchange occurs. Oxygen gets picked up by the oxygen-carrying molecules in the blood called hemoglobin. And of course, CO2 is dumped off. So as you can see, the deoxygenated blood, as it passes through the pulmonary system, the color changes to red, which signifies oxygenated blood. Now, when the deoxygenated blood passes through the pulmonary system, it is fully oxygenated, unless, of course, there's a disease situation like a pulmonary embolism, or you are in a low oxygen or low atmospheric pressure environment. So the fully oxygenated blood returns to the left side of the heart into the left atrium via the pulmonary vein. And again, this is the only incidence when oxygenated blood will flow through a vein, only through the pulmonary vein. So in the left atrium, you have oxygenated blood, and the atrium will again contract in the next heartbeat. From the left atrium, the oxygenated blood will be pumped into the left ventricle, and the ventricles will again contract, and the oxygenated blood in the left ventricle will be pushed out into the arterial system. These are your systemic arteries. Through the arterial system, the oxygenated blood will be transported to various tissues in the body, such as muscle, as shown here. The oxygenated blood will funnel through the capillary network surrounding tissues and cells and dump off the oxygen. So as the oxygenated blood passes through the capillaries, the blood becomes deoxygenated. Not fully deoxygenated, just deoxygenated to some extent. The deoxygenated blood then returns back to the heart into the right atrium through the veins. And again, this is referred to as venous return. And this cycle occurs over and over again with every heartbeat. So please have this memorized before moving forward and watch this animations as many times as you need to make sure you understand circulation throughout the cardiovascular system. Again, I'm sure this is basic knowledge for most of you, but be sure to have a solid understanding of this. Now, this slide is just more some review on the circulation of blood, specifically in the heart itself. Here, the heart is shown in a textbook fashion from a first-person view, so the right side is on your left and vice versa. Now, just take some time to review this information on this slide just so you are familiar with the flow of blood through the heart. Deoxygenated blood from the veins comes through into the atrium, into the right ventricles, through the pulmonary artery, to the lungs to become oxygenated, and oxygenated blood comes back to the heart through the pulmonary veins into the left atrium, then into the left ventricle, then out the aorta, which is the main artery, into the arterial system. And that oxygenated blood then gets delivered to all the tissues in the body and then again returns back to the right atrium eventually through venous return. So let's talk about the pump of the cardiovascular system, the heart. We know that in order for blood to circulate throughout the body, as shown a couple slides back, the heart needs to pump. More specifically, the atria, then the ventricles, need to contract, thus forming a heartbeat. So how does a heart contract to form a heartbeat? In other words, what is the mechanism underlying the contraction of the atrium, then the ventricles? It is much like skeletal muscle in that it starts with an electrical stimulus and ends with the contraction of muscles in the heart, which I said was called cardiac muscle. Another term used to describe cardiac muscle is myocardium. So myocardium, aka cardiac muscle, is made up of cardiac muscle cells, otherwise known as myocardial cells. I'll use those two terms interchangeably. So in response to an electrical stimulus, the myocardial cells of the atrium will contract, followed by the contraction of myocardial cells in the ventricles, forming the two thumps in a heartbeat. This process altogether is referred to as cardiac excitation contraction coupling, or EC coupling for short. However, this EC coupling is different from skeletal muscle EC coupling, which we discussed in our first lecture series of the semester. The major difference is that cardiac EC coupling and therefore the heartbeat is involuntary, while skeletal muscle contractions are voluntary. So how is it that the heart can contract involuntarily, meaning without having you to consciously contract it? It is because the heart has the ability to produce contractions intrinsically and extrinsically. In other words, the heart has the ability to generate an electrical stimulus and contract by itself without the need of any extrinsic or external stimulus. This extrinsic stimulus is referring to the nervous system. So because the heart has an intrinsic ability to contract, it can contract without even any stimulus from the nervous system. This is obviously very different from skeletal muscle, which requires extrinsic stimulation from the nervous system to contract. Also, however, the heart's contraction can be stimulated further by extrinsic stimuli, not necessarily stimulated, but stimulated further beyond the intrinsic mechanisms. And again, this extrinsic or external stimuli comes from the nervous system. So in certain cases, the nervous system can further stimulate the heart to produce a faster rate of contraction, or to simply put it, an increase in heart rate. Now in skeletal muscle, the extrinsic stimulus comes from the somatic nervous system, which includes the motor neurons. What about the heart? What provides the extrinsic stimulation of the heart? The autonomic nervous system, which is self-regulated and does not need voluntary activation, meaning the autonomic nervous system will know when to stimulate the heart further. So in summary, the intrinsic mechanisms, which again are in the heart itself, keep the heart contracting by itself at a resting rate, also known simply as resting heart rate. In certain situations, the extrinsic mechanisms through the autonomic nervous system can provide further stimulation to increase the rate of contractions or heartbeat. In other words, to increase the heart rate. And one of the major reasons why the heartbeat is involuntary is because these intrinsic and extrinsic stimuli are involuntary. In other words, they occur automatically. So how is the heartbeat controlled intrinsically? In other words, what are the intrinsic mechanisms in the heart itself that allow the heart to contract by itself without any extrinsic stimulation from the nervous system? We said earlier that myocardial contraction of both the atrium and the ventricles start with an electrical stimulus. So the heartbeat starts with an electrical stimulus. So if the heart has an intrinsic ability to contract without any extrinsic stimulation from the nervous system, this means that the heart can generate the electrical stimulus by itself. It can generate the electrical signal needed to contract the atrium and ventricles. This is referred to as automaticity, which is also referred to as spontaneous rhythmicity. Automaticity is the process by which specialized cardiac cells in the heart spontaneously or automatically generate an electrical stimulus or signal, which is then propagated or spread throughout the heart to stimulate contractions of the myocardium, first in the atrium and lastly in the ventricles. In other words, these specialized cardiac cells in the heart produce the electrical stimulus by itself without any voluntary action. These specialized cardiac cells, as listed here, have the ability to generate an electrical signal, or in other words, they have the ability to depolarize and produce action potentials, which are terms introduced earlier this semester. The most important one of these is the first one, the Sinoatrial Node, or SA node, also known as the sinus node. This is the most important one because it is considered the pacemaker. This is where the heartbeat starts. It starts with the automatic generation of an electrical signal or action potential by the SA node. This action potential then propagates through the atrium myocardium and then eventually to the ventricle myocardium, contracting those compartments in that order. The other cardiac cells that have the intrinsic ability to generate action potentials include the AV node, the AV bundle, and Purkinje fibers, which are nerve-type cells. So they have the ability to depolarize. So even if the SA node has issues producing the action potential, these other cells can. But then the heartbeat will be out of rhythm because, as we will discuss later, there's a particular order of events that need to occur to produce a normal heartbeat, starting with the SA node generating the initial electrical stimulus. Now, intrinsically, again, without any influence of the nervous system, which again is an extrinsic stimulus, the heart can beat by itself up to around 100 beats per minute, with normal ranges being around 60 to 100. This is your resting heart rate. So your intrinsic heart rate is your true resting heart rate. This is without any stimulus from the autonomic nervous system. This means the SA node can initiate an electrical signal or action potential 60 to 100 times per minute. Obviously, this can only be measured when there is no extrinsic stimulation from the autonomic nervous system. So you have to be completely rested to get a true intrinsic resting heart rate value. Usually people will test this as soon as they wake up without an alarm, or you can just test this while you sleep using heart rate monitoring technologies. The intrinsic ability for your heart to beat, so the ability for your heart to beat by itself, can be observed during a heart transplant. You could probably find a video of this on YouTube. During surgery, the heart is removed from the patient. In other words, it is de-innervated, meaning it is disconnected from the nervous system. But you will see that the heart continues to contract by itself, even without any connection to the nervous system. That is again because it can produce electrical signals by itself through these specialized cells, especially the SA node. But the takeaway here is that the heart can beat without any influence or even connection to the nervous system. Remember, the nervous system just provides an extrinsic stimulus to stimulate the heart further beyond what the intrinsic mechanisms can. So with that, the intrinsic mechanisms within the heart function to form a normal cardiac rhythm. A cardiac rhythm is simply the manner in which the heart beats. We generally know a normal heartbeat contains two sounds, and I alluded to earlier that the first sound is from the contraction of the atrium to pump blood into the ventricles. Then after the ventricles fill up, the ventricles then contract, forming the second sound of the heartbeat. The blood is then ejected from the left ventricle to the systemic arteries and the right ventricles to the pulmonary artery. So how does a normal heartbeat or cardiac rhythm look like? What are the criteria for a normal cardiac rhythm? First, the intrinsic heart rate, so true resting heart rate, should be between 60 to 100 beats per minute. If you have a resting heart rate below 60, that is referred to as bradycardia, and a resting heart rate above 100 beats per minute, you have tachycardia. Now again, 60 to 100 beats per minute is the normal rate by which your heart beats intrinsically by itself without any extrinsic influence of the nervous system. So this means it is normal for the SA node to generate an electrical signal or action potential 60 to 100 times per minute. Next, as I mentioned earlier, the heartbeat should originate from the SA node, meaning the SA node should be where the initial electrical signal or action potential is produced. And we can see that in this animation with the SA node or sinus node flashing purple. This is where it all starts. Now, the third criteria states that the cardiac impulse, which is the signal in the form of action potentials, should travel through the normal conduction pathway. So what is this normal pathway? We already know that it all starts at the SA node. Now, as you can see in this animation, from the SA node, the action potentials or electrical signal or impulse travel next through the atrium from the top to the bottom of the atrium. Please take note of that, from the top to the bottom. And we know the atrium is made up of cardiac muscle cells or myocardial cells. So as the action potential propagates or travels from the top to the bottom of the atrium will contract from the top to the bottom. Now, why do you think the electrical signal or action potential passes through the atrium from top to the bottom to contract the cardiac muscle cells from the atrium from the top to the bottom? Well, it's because the atrium needs to pump blood into the ventricles, which are directly below it. So after the action potential propagates through the atrium from top to bottom, it passes through the AV node. Then the action potential propagates through these nerve fibers called the bundle of His and bundle branches into the Purkinje fibers. From here, you can see the action potential propagate through the ventricles from bottom up. And why do you think it propagates in that direction through the ventricles? Well, it's because the ventricles need to pump blood out into arterial vessels, which are on the upper portion of the ventricles. The valve opening to the pulmonary artery is right about here on the right ventricle, and the aortic valve leading into the systemic arteries is about right here on the left ventricle. So in summary, the normal conduction pathway is SA node, top to bottom of the atrium, AV node, bundle of His, bundle branches, Purkinje fibers, and ventricles from bottom to the top. And at this point, the action potential will terminate. And through that entire conduction pathway, we have the heartbeat, with the atrial contraction first, followed by the ventricular contraction. Now lastly, not only does the electrical cardiac impulse need to propagate through the normal pathway, it needs to propagate with normal conduction velocity. In other words, it needs to pass through each part of the pathway at a particular velocity. Now, as you can see here, the action potential propagates at a velocity of 1 meters per second through the atrium from top to bottom. Then at the AV node, the propagation is slowed down to 0.05 meters per second. The propagation is slowed down at the AV node so that the atrium has enough time to fill the ventricle before the ventricle contracts. And this is why the AV node is often referred to as the pace regulator. Now the signal then propagates through the bundle of His at 2 meters per second, then the right and left bundle branches at 2 meters per second, through the Purkinje fibers at 4 meters per second, and through the ventricles from bottom up at 1 meters per second, just like the atrium. So when there's any deviation from any of these criteria, you may have an abnormal cardiac rhythm, also known as an arrhythmia. These criteria indicate a normal cardiac rhythm, which means blood flow through the heart is normal. So when there is deviation from these criteria and there is an arrhythmia, blood flow is negatively affected. If the action potentials don't propagate through the normal conduction pathway, for example, or if the action potential propagates too fast or slow, or if the SA node can't initiate the electrical signal, then you will most likely have an arrhythmia. Oftentimes, arrhythmias occur when there is some type of damage to the heart, like when cardiac muscle cells become damaged following a heart attack or myocardial infarction. Let's say the damaged myocardial cells are here within the atrium. So as the signals propagate through the atrium from top to bottom, which is the normal conduction pathway, these damaged cells may disrupt its pathway. Sometimes the action potential propagates around the damaged cells and just circulates like this. This causes the cells around the damaged area to constantly contract because the action potentials don't pass through it. This causes something called a flutter. In this example, an atrial flutter, which is when the muscle cells of the atrium contract in a fluttering manner due to the inability for the electrical signals to just pass through normally. This would obviously cause an arrhythmia and in turn negatively affect blood flow. In this example, because the atrial contractions are negatively affected, the blood doesn't pump effectively into the ventricles, and this creates a chain reaction, as you can imagine. Also, there are times when the SA node becomes damaged during infarction, leaving the SA node impaired, unable to generate and initiate the action potential needed to start the heartbeat. This would cause an arrhythmia. Specifically, criteria number 2 would be affected. So for those with the damaged SA node, what is put in by the physician in place of the SA node? A pacemaker, which is an artificial SA node. It's a device that produces electrical signals automatically, like the SA node, at about 60 to 100 times per minute to produce a normal resting heart rate of 60 to 100 beats per minute. Okay, so this is the criteria for a normal cardiac rhythm. And again, this is to ensure proper blood flow through the heart and thus to the rest of the body. So when there is an arrhythmia, we have poor blood flow not only to the heart, but also to the rest of the body. And this is why people with arrhythmias have low exercise capacity and fatigue with lower workloads, since without proper blood flow through the heart, there is poor blood flow to the tissues like muscles, which means less oxygen supply, which means low anaerobic threshold. All right, so the next question we need to tackle is how does the SA node generate the electrical signal or action potential automatically? Again, going back to the term automaticity, which is the spontaneous or automatic generation of an electrical signal to stimulate myocardial contraction. So here we are explaining how the SA node depolarizes itself to produce an action potential, which will then subsequently propagate through the normal conduction pathway as described in the prior slide. Now here on top, we have a figure that shows membrane potential on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. And I'm going to take you through the process by which a heartbeat is initiated by the SA node. Again, automatically. So the SA node can automatically generate an action potential without extrinsic stimulation from the nervous system because it can never rest. In other words, there is always something causing it to depolarize. Now, as we discussed in skeletal muscle EC coupling, what causes a cell to depolarize? What causes a cell's membrane potential to rise? It's when positively charged ions enter the cell, otherwise known as influx. So here we have some channels called the funny channels, which is denoted as I subscript F channels. And this again is located on the SA node membrane. Now these channels can be described as leaky sodium ion channels. And these sodium ions are positively charged. Now, most of you should know that sodium is highly concentrated outside the cell, and so if there is a channel opening, it will influx into the cell. So because these funny channels are leaky to sodium influx, the SA node can never truly rest. It is always going to want to depolarize, and we see that here. So these funny channels, as they leak in sodium, will cause a steady depolarization from negative 60 to about negative 45 millivolts, which is denoted by this A here. Now at negative 45 millivolts, the SA node is going to have another set of ion channels open, and these are called the T-type VDCCs. The T stands for transient, meaning these channels open for a very brief period of time. And VDCC stands for voltage-dependent calcium channels. So these calcium channels are dependent on voltage, meaning it will only open at a certain membrane potential. That membrane potential is negative 45. So the funny channels depolarize the SA node to negative 45, and then the T-type VDCCs open and allow calcium influx, more positively charged ions influxing into the SA node. Now, since T-type VDCCs are open briefly, this influx of positively charged calcium will cause further yet steady depolarization from negative 45 millivolts to about negative 30 millivolts, as you can see here from point A to point B. Now at point B, which is negative 30 millivolts, we have another set of VDCCs called L-type VDCCs. The L stands for long type. These calcium channels open in response to a membrane potential of negative 30 millivolts, and they open for a longer period, allowing much more calcium influx. Now, as you see here, this causes rapid depolarization of the SA node to about 0 millivolts. This is where an action potential is generated, here at 0 millivolts. Now, as described in the previous slide, this action potential generated here represents that purple flash on the SA node, which subsequently propagates to the atrium and then through the rest of the conduction pathway, ending in the ventricles. So the action potential represents a single heartbeat because it causes the atrium and then the ventricles to contract and pump blood. So if I ask the question, which of the following describes a process immediately preceding this action potential in the SA node, it would be calcium influx through the L-type VDCCs. If I ask which of the following describes a process that causes the initial depolarization from negative 60 to negative 45 millivolts, it would be the influx of sodium through the funny channels. Okay, so as we know in electrophysiology, after an action potential is generated, the membrane potential needs to return back down. And this process is called repolarization, which is essentially the opposite of depolarization. And like all cells that are excitable, the SA node repolarizes through the efflux of positively charged potassium ions. So your SA node gets rid of positive ions to make the membrane potential less positive. Now the SA node repolarizes back down, and as I said earlier, the SA node can never rest. It will automatically generate another cycle of depolarization and action potential generation. Why? Because again, the funny channels are constantly leaking in sodium. So there's no way for the SA node to stay rested. It will constantly try to depolarize because it is constantly leaking in positively charged sodium ions through the funny channels. Now, this explains why the SA node can generate automatic or spontaneous electrical signals or action potentials without the need of any extrinsic stimulus from the autonomic nervous system. So as you can see here, this cycle repeats itself over and over again at a rate between 60 to 100 times per minute without any extrinsic stimulation, equating to about 60 to 100 beats per minute, which again is the normal range for your intrinsic resting heart rate. So what explains the intrinsic ability for the heart to contract? It is because the SA node can automatically generate by itself an action potential. Why? Because it is constantly leaky to sodium influx through the funny channels. It can never truly rest. All right, so what is next on the conduction pathway? Once the SA node generates an action potential, where does that action potential propagate to? Remember, it propagates next to the atrium to contract the cardiac muscle or myocardium and produce an atrial contraction, which is for pumping blood into the ventricles. So here we have the action potential denoted by a lightning bolt. This was generated again by the SA node, which we discussed in the previous slide. Now it has propagated to the atrium, more specifically the myocardial cells of the atrium. Now remember, the action potential propagates from top to bottom, so this process that I'm about to demonstrate occurs throughout each of the myocardial cells from the atrium from top to the bottom. So let's see how the action potential causes a contraction in one single myocardial cell, which to remind you is a cardiac muscle cell. So the action potential propagates along the membrane of the myocardial cell. And on the membrane, we have other L-type VDCCs, just like the SA node. And these L-type VDCCs open in response to an action potential. So when they open, they allow for calcium influx into the myocardial cell. Now, once the calcium enters, it is going to cause a slight depolarization of the cardiac muscle cell, which triggers the dihydropyridine receptors, or DHPRs. This in turn will open the bottle cap of the sarcoplasmic reticulum called the ryanodine receptors. Now remember, the sarcoplasmic reticulum, just like skeletal muscle, holds intracellular calcium ions. The calcium from the SR will then exit, and the rest is just like skeletal muscle contraction in that calcium will bind to troponin on the thin filament and cross-bridge cycling will occur, causing a contraction of that myocardial cell. Now, I will not test you on the process of cross-bridge cycling since it is the same as your first lecture series. That's why I don't put that much detail in this slide regarding cross-bridge cycling. Now, this entire process is referred to as calcium-induced calcium release. Calcium-induced calcium release. So please take note of this term. Calcium-induced calcium release is the process by which extracellular calcium influxes through the L-type VDCCs in response to an action potential on the myocardial cell, causing the release of intracellular calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, leading to cross-bridge cycling and contraction. All right, so after all the myocardial cells in the atrium contract as the action potential propagates through, where does the action potential then go? It propagates through the AV node, which slows it down a bit to give the atrium enough time to contract and pump blood into the ventricles. Then the action potential propagates through the bundle of His, bundle branches, and the Purkinje fibers, and finally through the myocardium of the ventricle from bottom up. And please take note, this entire process right here occurs in the same way for the ventricular contractions. So ventricular myocardial cells receive the action potential, causing opening of the L-type VDCCs, which leads to calcium-induced calcium release, ending with cross-bridge cycling and contraction of the ventricle. So again, to reiterate, this mechanism shown here is relevant for both atrial and ventricular contractions. All right, so far I've discussed the mechanism of SA node automaticity and how it generates an action potential automatically and intrinsically without extrinsic stimulation at around 60 to 100 times per minute to produce an intrinsic heart rate of 60 to 100 beats per minute. Then I discuss, as shown here, how the action potential then creates a cardiac muscle contraction, first in the atrium and then in the ventricles. So now what happens when the SA node receives further stimulation from an extrinsic source or stimuli? Can the automaticity be further stimulated? Yes, as alluded to earlier, it can. The extrinsic control of the cardiac rhythm is through the autonomic nervous system, as I mentioned earlier. There are situations in which the nervous system can increase the SA node activity. In other words, the nervous system can increase pacemaker activity. So as you see here in the figure, we have the blue lines which represent the intrinsic production of action potentials by the SA node. We talked about how the initial depolarization is through leaky sodium influx through funny channels, followed by the two VDCCs causing rapid depolarization towards an action potential. Now, what if there was some influence of the nervous system causing increased automaticity of the SA node? This is represented by the red dotted line. Now, as you can see, within a given time frame, as represented by the x-axis, there are more action potentials generated by the SA node, meaning there is a greater rate of action potentials by the SA node, and thus a greater heart rate. Now, let's examine the red dotted line versus the blue dotted line. Now, the reason why more action potentials are generated by the SA node per given time is because the depolarization is much more rapid. You can see the initial depolarization here caused by the funny channels and the sodium influx is more rapid. And the depolarization caused by the T-type VDCCs and calcium influx is more rapid. And you see that the final depolarization leading up to the action potential via L-type VDCCs and large calcium influx is also more rapid. Thus, perhaps when the nervous system stimulates the SA node, there is greater influx of sodium and calcium ions through their respective channels on the SA node. And so when the SA node produces a higher rate of action potentials, well, there's going to be a higher heart rate since each action potential again leads to a heartbeat. This increase in SA node activity is referred to as sinus tachycardia. Together with an increase in SA node activity, you have an increase in also AV node activity, which is referred to as junctional tachycardia. So what extrinsic mechanism causes increased SA node activity and thus an increase in heart rate? It is caused by changes in the autonomic nervous system. We should all generally know by now that the autonomic nervous system is comprised of two nerve subsystems. We have the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. So when there is increased sympathetic nerve activity, there is greater input into the SA node from the sympathetic nerve. This causes the effect that we see here by the red dotted line. In the next two slides, we will discuss how the sympathetic nervous system causes this increased SA node activity, as again reflected by the red dotted line. This is also paired with the decrease in parasympathetic activity or tone. The parasympathetic nervous system suppresses SA node activity and thus heart rate. So when the parasympathetic activity, also known as parasympathetic tone, is reduced, the SA node activity and thus heart rate will naturally increase. So both of these changes, as you see in the first two bullet points, reflect the changes in the autonomic nervous system, which result in an increase in SA node activity and thus heart rate. So in what situation do you think these autonomic nervous system changes occur? Yes, during exercise. During exercise, you have increased sympathetic activity described as the fight or flight response, and you have a decrease in parasympathetic activity or tone. Together, this creates this effect as again reflected by the red dotted line. More action potentials and thus more heartbeats per given time. Now here we have a simple illustration of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves and where they innervate the heart. The sympathetic nerves innervate the SA node, the AV node, as well as the myocardium. This means the sympathetic nerve not only increases SA node as well as AV node activity to increase heart rate, it also stimulates the cardiac muscle directly in a way that increases the force of their contractions. The parasympathetic nerve, also known as the vagus nerve, innervates the SA node and the AV node only. And again, increased parasympathetic tone or activity, also known as vagal activity or tone, will suppress SA node and AV node activity, thus reducing heart rate. So as I said earlier, if you remove the vagal activity, SA node activity will naturally increase and thus increasing heart rate. More on this later. So again, these autonomic nerve systems are your extrinsic regulators of the cardiac rhythm. They will either accelerate or decelerate the heart rate, and they mainly work through the pacemaker, the SA node. So we are obviously talking about exercise, and so we want to understand how these extrinsic regulators increase SA node activity and thus heart rate. First, the sympathetic nervous system. How does increased sympathetic activity, like during exercise, stimulate the SA node activity further, causing an increased heart rate? It works through the release of a neurotransmitter called norepinephrine. This neurotransmitter is released by the sympathetic nerves and acts on the SA node as well as the AV node and the myocardium. As a result, they increase heart rate and force of myocardium contractions within the atrium as well as the ventricles. So sympathetic activity can, in summary, increase the rate of heart contractions and the force of heart contractions. Now, during increased sympathetic activity or fight or flight responses like exercise, sympathetic nerves can also stimulate the release of norepinephrine as well as its relative epinephrine from the adrenal gland, not as a neurotransmitter, but as a hormone. These hormones collectively are called catecholamines. Now, please take note of that. Norepinephrine and epinephrine are your catecholamines. Also note that norepinephrine and epinephrine are also referred to as noradrenaline and adrenaline, respectively. As a hormone, they circulate and eventually can interact with the SA node on the heart, causing further stimulation of the SA node. So to summarize, norepinephrine is released directly by the sympathetic nerve innervating the heart as a neurotransmitter. It is also released by the adrenal gland along with epinephrine as a hormone, which can eventually interact with the SA node. So with increased sympathetic activity, there is greater stimulation of the SA node activity, and thus the rate at which the action potentials are generated and propagated throughout the heart are increased. It can increase the SA node activity to produce a maximum of 250 action potentials per minute, which equates again to 250 beats per minute. So let's discuss specifically how these catecholamines, whether as a neurotransmitter or hormone, causes increased SA node automaticity or simply activity. So as I briefly mentioned earlier, the increase in SA node activity is reflected by an increased rate of depolarization and thus action potential production. So it would make sense that the sympathetic activity increases the rate of depolarization through the processes that cause depolarization in the SA node, which is sodium influx via funny channels and calcium influx via T and L-type VDCCs. So as I mentioned, increased sympathetic activity accompanies an increase in norepinephrine and epinephrine, your catecholamines. On the SA node membrane, you have specific catecholamine receptors called beta-1 adrenergic receptors, and that is indicated here on the figure. When epinephrine and norepinephrine, again, your catecholamines, are released during sympathetic activity, like during exercise, they can bind to these beta-1 adrenergic receptors on the SA node membrane. This subsequently stimulates a signaling pathway, which involves the activation of an enzyme called adenylate cyclase, which leads to an increase in cyclic AMP, or CAMP for short. An increase in CAMP stimulates increased sodium influx through the funny channels. CAMP can also activate the enzyme protein kinase A, which subsequently can increase calcium influx through the voltage-dependent calcium channels, both the T-type and L-type. This means that during sympathetic activity, like during exercise, there's increased influx of sodium and calcium, which in turn would cause a more rapid depolarization effect, as shown down here in this figure by the red dotted line. This means action potentials are generated at a faster rate, which would in turn translate to increased heart rate. So if I asked a question on the test, which of the following ways describes how sympathetic activity increases heart rate, the potential answers would be an increase in epinephrine and norepinephrine release and binding to the SA node beta-1 adrenergic receptors, increased influx of positively charged sodium and calcium ions, increased rate of depolarization, and action potential generation in the SA node. Now, just as a side note, since a lot of us are avid caffeine consumers, we generally know that with caffeine consumption, we have a slight increase in heart rate. This is due to the effects of caffeine or methylxanthines on the SA node. Caffeine is known to increase CAMP levels in the SA node, which, as we said earlier, would increase sodium influx through the funny channels, as well as increase protein kinase A activity, which would in turn increase calcium influx through the VDCCs. Now, this may be related to a potential bonus question, so please go ahead and take a side note of this. Okay, so now what about the parasympathetic activity and how the parasympathetic nervous system regulates the cardiac rhythm? First, remember we said that parasympathetic activity suppresses the heart rate by suppressing the SA node as well as the AV node activity. It suppresses the SA node, for example, through the release of its specific neurotransmitter, acetylcholine. When acetylcholine binds to its receptors on the SA node, it will hyperpolarize the SA node. Hyperpolarization is essentially an extended repolarization, so it would take the SA node a longer time to depolarize towards an action potential. This would in turn decrease heart rate and indirectly decrease the force of the heart contraction. An increase in parasympathetic activity would decrease the heart rate below the intrinsic heart rate, which is about 60 to 100 beats per minute. Some individuals, like well-trained endurance athletes who are very energy efficient and do not require elevated oxygen delivery to tissues like muscle, have a very low resting heart rate due to increased parasympathetic activity during rest. And sometimes the resting heart rate can fall as low as 35 beats per minute, meaning the parasympathetic activity suppresses the SA node to a point where only about 35 action potentials per minute are produced. But right now we're talking about exercise and an increase in heart rate. So what did we say earlier about how the SA node activity and thus heart rate increases? One way is through increased sympathetic activity, which we just detailed. The other way is through a decrease in parasympathetic activity. So a decrease in parasympathetic activity would simply withdraw the suppression of the SA node and thus would result in a natural increase in SA node activity as well as heart rate. This withdrawal of the parasympathetic activity or tone to the heart is referred to as vagal withdrawal. Vagal referring to the vagus nerve, which is the main parasympathetic nerve that innervates the heart. So if I ask the question, which of the following describes the extrinsic mechanism by which the heart rate increases, it would be increased sympathetic activity and vagal withdrawal. This means you should know that vagal withdrawal is referring to the parasympathetic withdrawal, or a decrease in parasympathetic activity on the heart. So during exercise, increased sympathetic activity and vagal withdrawal increases heart rate at different times, and this is represented by this figure here. On the x-axis, you have percentage of maximal oxygen uptake, or VO2 max, which is a scale of intensity. We have rest on the far left and 100% VO2 max on the right, representing maximum intensity. On the y-axis, you have heart rate. So as most of us know, heart rate increases directly proportionate to exercise intensity. and that is denoted by this black arrow pointing up and to the right. What this figure shows is that increases in heart rate from resting heart rate to about 100 beats per minute is due to vagal withdrawal, and that is denoted by a minus sign and vagus. This means vagal withdrawal, reducing parasympathetic activity on the heart, particularly on the SA node. So essentially, the initial increase in heart rate when you exercise is due to vagal withdrawal, not due to increased sympathetic activity. Now, as you see here, increases in heart rate from about 100 beats per minute all the way to max heart rate is due to increased sympathetic activity, denoted here with the plus sign and sympathetic. So if I ask the question from resting heart rate to about 100 beats per minute, increases in heart rate is due to which of the following, the answer would be vagal withdrawal, which again is a reduction in parasympathetic activity on the heart, more specifically on the SA node. If I asked which of the following is responsible for an increasing heart rate above 100 beats per minute to maximum heart rate, the answer would be increased sympathetic activity. Now, in the next 3 slides, I present some sample exam questions or recap questions I want you to take a look at, and I want you to attempt each of these questions and try to answer them to the best of your ability. If you don't understand what the answer to any of these questions are, please shoot me a quick email. Now that we've discussed the basic physiological function of the heart, let's talk about now the vessels. The first blood vessel that we introduced earlier are the high pressure distribution vessels called your arteries. And they are generally high pressure because they have thick muscular walls. And the type of muscle that arteries contain is called smooth muscle. So like any other type of muscle like cardiac and skeletal muscle, smooth muscle has also the ability to contract. When smooth muscle contracts, the arterial vessels constrict. In other words, they are in a way squeezed, quote unquote. This is called vasoconstriction. So any area along the arterial vessel that undergoes vasoconstriction, there is high pressure. Anywhere along the arterial vessel that is relaxed or vasodilated, there is low pressure. And as I briefly mentioned earlier, fluids like blood flow from high to low pressure. So arteries have the intrinsic ability to create high to low pressure to facilitate blood flow towards the tissues of the body. Now later on, we will talk about how arteries are adjusted during exercise to increase blood flow to active muscles. More on that later. As for some minor details here, the main artery leaving the heart, more particularly the left ventricle, is called the aorta. And the rest of the arteries that carry blood towards various tissues in the body are simply called arteries. Arteries funnel into smaller arteries called arterioles, which in turn funnel into the capillary network, which again are microvessels where exchange occurs with cells, like with oxygen and carbon dioxide. And like I said earlier, the capillaries surround tissue like muscle, and this is where substances are exchanged with the cells like oxygen and carbon dioxide, as I mentioned earlier. Now, the flow of blood through the capillary network is controlled by precapillary sphincters, which are essentially valves that open and close to allow blood to flow in from the arterial vessels and to flow out into the veins. Here, we see the capillary network of muscles at rest versus during exercise. Now, real briefly, you can see at rest that there is no blood flow through the arterial vessels, and the precapillary sphincters are closed because there's no pressure to open them. But during exercise, when there is increased blood flow to the muscle through arterial vessels, which we will discuss in much more detail later, there is enough pressure to open the precapillary sphincters and blood can flow through the capillary network. And as the blood flows through the capillary network, substances are exchanged with the cells. Now, after the blood passes through the capillaries and dumps off, say, all the oxygen and picks up all the CO2, it flows out into the venules, which are smaller veins. From the venules, the blood enters the veins, which are low-pressure vessels that carry blood back to the heart. And the reason why veins are low pressure is because they lack smooth muscle to allow for vasoconstriction and dilation, at least intrinsically. This means veins do not have the intrinsic ability, like arteries do, to create high to low pressure gradients to facilitate blood flow back to the heart. So how does blood return to the heart via the veins when it does not have the ability to create high to low pressure gradients by itself? Veins rely on external pumping mechanisms to help create high to low pressure gradients for blood flow, especially upwards from the lower body against gravity. I like to use the analogy of an otter pop or a Go-Gurt packet or a toothpaste tube. If you want to get the toothpaste out of the tube, what do? You would squeeze the bottom of the tube. When you squeeze the bottom of the tube, you create high pressure on that part of the tube, and therefore the toothpaste will flow from where it's high pressure where you're squeezing the tube to low pressure where you're not squeezing the tube. And as a result, the toothpaste can be squeezed out of the tube. This is a very similar concept with venous return. We have two external pumping mechanisms that facilitate venous return, which again is blood flow back to the heart through the veins. We have the muscle pump system and the ventilatory pump system. The muscle pump is depicted here in the figure to the right. Veins are compartmentalized in sections that are separated by one-way valves, and you can see that here. Here we see one compartment with a one-way valve down here and a one-way valve up here. Now these are one-way valves, so blood can only flow through one direction, and that is towards the heart. So as the muscle contracts, it can squeeze the veins, creating high pressure, just like squeezing the toothpaste tube. This will force blood to flow through the one-way valve and into the next compartment up. We know that the blood will not flow backwards into the preceding compartment because these are, again, one-way valves to prevent backflow. The other pumping mechanism is the ventilatory pump, which is always active because we are constantly breathing. Every time we inhale and exhale, we create changes in intrathoracic pressure. The changes in the intrathoracic pressure are able to constrict and relax veins, creating high to low pressure gradients and facilitating blood flow back to the heart, aka venous return. So how is this pumping mechanism for venous return related to exercise? Well, during exercise, we are obviously contracting our muscles continuously, and thus we are facilitating blood flow back to the heart. And this is why during exercise, there's increased venous return along with increased distribution of blood from the heart through the arteries. In other words, the heart receives more volume of blood for a given time frame during exercise compared to rest because the muscle pump is highly active, creating high to low pressure gradients, facilitating venous return. This in turn will provide the heart with more blood to eject and distribute via the arteries. So what other situations are the muscle pumps implicated in to facilitate venous return, especially as it relates to exercise? The muscle pump is highly implicated in the cool down following heavy lower body exercise. During heavy lower body exercise, like during high intensity interval training or sprint interval training or just a long run, the cardiovascular system will redirect blood flow to the active lower body muscles because the lower body muscles are the most active and they require the blood, more specifically the oxygen. Now we will of course talk about this mechanism in much more detail later on, but for now let's talk about why a cool down will be important after this type of exercise. After you are done with the lower body exercise, there is a large quantity of blood pooled in the lower body. This is referred to as venous pooling. Now, because veins are low pressure and they do not have the intrinsic ability to create high to low pressure gradients to facilitate blood flow back to the heart, it is difficult for all the blood pooled in the lower body to return to the heart, especially if it needs to fight against gravity. Therefore, what do you think you can do after you are done exercising to facilitate venous return? One of the primary ways to do this is through activating the muscle pump, which means continue to contract your lower body muscles through what we call a cool down, which is essentially light exercise after your heavy exercise bout. This will create the high to low pressure gradients necessary to facilitate blood flow through the veins back to the heart, aka venous return. Sometimes, especially after prolonged heavy lower body exercise, when one does not cool down and simply stands up, blood pooled in the lower body is not efficiently returning to the heart, and therefore there is less blood that the heart can distribute to the rest of the body, including the head. And sometimes this may cause one to faint or get dizzy because the head is not receiving sufficient blood supply, since a lot of blood is pooled in the lower body. This is why it is important after prolonged heavy lower body exercise to cool down, to help facilitate blood flow back to the heart via the veins through the muscle pump system. So if I ask the question, how does a cool down after heavy lower body exercise facilitate blood flow back to the heart? The answer will be through the muscle pump mechanism.